And we're back. Joining us now, MSNBC's Rachel Maddow, New York Times columnist David Brooks, former Democratic Congressman Harold Ford Jr., and Republican Congressman Aaron Schock. He is the youngest member of Congress, the first to be born in the 80s. We should point out, and he represents the 18th District of Illinois, which includes Peoria, the 7th largest city in that state, and he's been chosen by his party's leadership to serve as a deputy Republican whip and even received a waiver to serve on 3 committees in the House instead of the usual 2. So welcome to the program for the first time. A lot to get to, all of you. David Brooks, the national security fight. You heard Vice President Biden taking on his predecessor. This is now a fully engaged argument about whether the Obama administration is sufficiently serious when it's taking on the war on terror. He said of Cheney, he's either misinformed or misinforming.
On the big picture, he's right. I mean, if you cover the Obama administration, they take it seriously. The idea that they don't know we're at war, they don't pay attention, they have the daily intelligence briefs. They take this utterly seriously. So Cheney's large charge is completely bogus. As for the specifics, I think there are a couple things he's right about. The KSM trial has become a total mess. What Joe Biden said today on the program doesn't pass the laugh test. The idea that we're going to try a guy, not acquit him apparently beforehand, are we going to make Dick Cheney the foreman of the jury? I mean, how do we know that? And then let him walk free. And then the second thing I think Cheney's actually right about is Mirandizing. If we had said we captured the 9/11 guys on September 10th, or one of them, should we have read that guy's rights and given him a lawyer? No, we should have tried to get some intelligence out of the guy.
Rachel?
There isn't in this case, and there hasn't been in any known modern terrorism case, any correlation between the usefulness of an interrogation and whether or not somebody gets read their Miranda rights. It just isn't the case. And in every single instance, every single terrorism case where there's been an arrest in this country in a terrorism case since 9/11, every single one has been handled, the person has been handled as a civilian criminal. There was a moment when Jose Padilla and Ali Al-Mari were handled in military custody. There's nothing magic about the time that they were in military custody. They didn't do any more magical forms of talking that they wouldn't do when they were civilians. So even on those grounds, I think that what you see as being correct in the vice president's charges, I just don't think it's there.
Furthermore, I think it's only fair. This president has been as tough as anyone's been on terrorists. Throughout his campaign, he promised he was willing to go into Pakistan if need be. He was criticized by Republicans and Democrats. As you heard Vice President Biden, they've taken down several of the top 20 that we wanted to find in Afghanistan and Iraq. Our efforts in Afghanistan, 35,000 additional troops, some in the Democratic Party were opposed to it. This president charged ahead. The efforts in the last few days, I think we can point around the edges a bit, but I think it's unfair to say this administration has not been tough, has not been focused and determined in going after terrorists.
Congressman Schock, the accusation that is still leveled and that former Vice President Cheney in an interview this morning is saying is that the administration does not consider these acts of war. They are still considering them criminal acts, which he says is the wrong way to keep America safe.
Well, look, all I can tell you is what my constituents are telling me and where I think most of Americans are, which is they see an American citizen who attacks our soldiers at a base in Fort Hood, Texas, tried in a military tribunal, and they see a foreigner who comes to our soil for the sole purpose of attacking our country and our American citizens, and he's read his Miranda rights. The majority of Americans, the polls indicate, do not support the president and this administration's plan to try these people in civilian court. And I think it's rightfully so why the administration is now backpedaling on their decision to hold these trials in downtown
Let me
New
just
York.
take on one issue that you can make your point. I want to go back to the Khalid Sheikh Mohammed trial, because I think this is the point that I was trying to ask the Vice President about. Here was the headline in the Washington Post this week about how this is unfolding politically, which is not well for the administration. Obama to help pick the location of the terror trial, which can only be seen as a shot against his attorney general and his decision originally to put it in New York, which they reversed from. The tension here, Rachel, the whole reason why there are enemy combatants is to say these are warriors. They're not criminals. The president says that al-Qaeda is trying to destroy America, that we are at war. So these are warriors. And by virtue of the fact that the administration is saying we're never going to release this guy, even if he were to be acquitted, does that not make the point that they should not even enter our justice system where there is due process, where there is a presumption of innocence, where any prosecutor knows the consequences that the defendant walks if they're not convicted?
I think that even in the case of heinous crimes that have nothing to do with terrorism, that have nothing to do with foreign nationals, there is a frustration that there's a case that people who we believe are guilty might somehow get away. There's this frustration. That's what drives lynch mob mentality. I mean, we've always had that sort of tension. But the fact remains there have been 3 convictions under military tribunals, 3, and 2 of the people convicted are now free. It's no great guarantee that anything awesome is going to happen in terms of guaranteeing guilt and guaranteeing a long sentence to do the tribunal route. When Richard Reid came up in civilian court and he tried to make the case that he wanted to be called a soldier, he wanted to be treated in the terms of war, the judge in the case, William Young, said, "You are not an enemy combatant, you are a terrorist, you are not a you are not a soldier in any war. To call you a soldier gives you far too much stature. War talk is way out of line in this court. You're a big fellow, but you're not that big. You're no warrior. I know warriors. You are a terrorist, a species of criminal, guilty of multiple attempted murders." I think Americans cheer that sentiment and the idea that we're going to elevate Khalid Sheikh Mohammed and call him some sort of warrior when he's comparing himself to George Washington at Guantanamo.
But David Brooks, the president is expending a great deal of political capital on a decision that was being made to put him in the civilian system so that the rest of the world thinks we're fair. And yet, the vice president this morning is saying he's going to be convicted, he's going to die. Other administration officials, including the president, have said that he'll most likely face the death penalty. How is this holding up American jurisprudence?
Yeah, well, there's a policy in transition. Eric Holder, the Attorney General, took this decision without consulting the president, without consulting the national security apparatus, did it on his own. And slowly and now quickly, the White House is pulling that back. And so they are going to try to, I think, take it out of New York, but they're not there yet. The idea that we can try someone and guarantee a conviction and guarantee they won't walk free, I mean, this is a betrayal of our values. I mean, what the correct charges against Gitmo were that it's a betrayal of our values. We're fighting our values in a way that we're fighting this war in a way that betrays who we really are. And this is the essence of that. What Joe Biden said on the program today will be laughed at around the Arab world.
Congressman Schock, the larger question of Republican dissent, if you look at it that way, or attacks on this administration. The top terrorism advisor to the president said this on this program last week.
I'm tiring of politicians using national security issues such as terrorism as a political football.
Are Republicans and Republican attacks against this administration helping al-Qaeda?
Absolutely not. And I think it's insult to most Americans to suggest that their elected representatives who are carrying their views and the message of the majority of Americans to Washington and to this debate are somehow helping al-Qaeda. Mind you, many of these Democrats, including Mr. Brennan, who served in the last administration, faced many of these same attacks under then President Bush from the left. So the idea that we can't challenge the administration and their view on the fight on terrorism is completely
What happened
bogus.
to Democrats when they challenged President Bush in the same way?
Some of the same claims were made against them. But at the end of the day, we're representing mainstream America and the majority of views. And whether it's closing Guantanamo Bay and moving it to the heartland of America, whether it's trying these folks in downtown New York, whether it's Mirandizing terrorists who come to this country to attack us, the majority of Americans have not bought, do not believe that Obama and his administration is right on these policies.
So you don't support the way the president is prosecuting the war on terror?
No.
I can appreciate the politics that are played here, and we're heading into a cycle, and we just met. I think he's a nice guy and a good guy, but to suggest that this administration is not focused in a right way and determined to keep America safe, I think it's just not right and foolish. I think there's a legitimate conversation about whether Khalid Sheikh Mohammed should be tried in my home city. I disagree with the administration. I'm glad now we are revisiting and looking at a different location. I was against it because I think the costs are too high. We're in the middle of a recession. It would cost them $225 million a year to try him there. We could spend that money in a jobs program, an education program, or even to pay down the debt. But to suggest to play politics at this moment, the Democrats raised the same concerns when Bush was in office, and the same answers were given, and some similar answers were given by Republicans. The truth of the matter is, Congress and the Senate ought to be focused on our efforts in Afghanistan, Iraq, and ensuring that our AFPAC policy works. The conversation around Pakistan and Kashmir and whether or not a resolution there will help us resolve our issues in Afghanistan are far more important than a volleyball going back and forth about who's at fault. Barack Obama and his administration deserve tremendous credit for what they've done up to this moment.
All right, quick comment, then I want to go move to domestic matters.
First of all, I want to make it clear, nobody's suggesting that President Obama or his administration don't want us to be safe. What we're suggesting is he's taking unnecessary risks.
Well, can I just, I'm sorry though, what's the basis of the assertion that reading somebody their Miranda rights is unsafe? We did that
Rachel,
with every, wait, hold on, we did that with every single person who has been arrested on terrorism charges since 9/11. Nobody's ever made an issue of it until the Obama administration and this case with Abdul Muttalib. Literally, what's the problem with being read your rights? That wasn't the problem before.
Well, first of all, you suggested earlier that reading someone's Miranda rights has never indicated that they talk less to our intelligence
We've never
folks.
heard that from the FBI.
The fact of the matter is we do know that after the Christmas Day bomber was read his Miranda rights, that he did in fact stop cooperating with our intelligence.
That's not true, actually. I mean, it's not what we know from the people who've been involved in it.
But there is,
the factual basis of these assertions is so thin.
Rachel's right about that. In fact, I think when he was read the rights, the report suggested that he shared more information after. And that could be wrong, but the question.
But there is a debate. There is a debate about whether he should have been treated throughout as an intelligence asset without being Mirandized in order to bring people in who had more expertise specific to Yemen. Now, I don't think any of us can know at this stage how much could be gleaned from FBI interrogators who are very good versus other intelligence assets. So I think that debate will continue. Let me take a break here. We're going to come back and talk about domestic matters and the Obama agenda. We'll be back with our roundtable right after this brief station. We are back now with our political roundtable. Let's talk about the Obama agenda. And you may not have known this or heard about it, but we had a fair amount of snow here in Washington over the past couple of weeks. Here is a cartoon that really captures the nexus between government and weather. Huge snowstorm. One guy says Washington is completely paralyzed. The other one says, and then came this snowstorm. And here we are, David Brooks, with a domestic agenda right now. And what's leading this off? It's not health care at the moment. It is a jobs bill. And there seemed to be bipartisan consensus on this. And now Majority Leader Harry Reid pulled it back, made it a much narrower bill, about $15 billion, mostly of tax breaks, to get people back to work. Is this going to go anywhere?
It'll go somewhere. But if this was your week to hate Washington, this was a good week for you. Because we got this bipartisan bill that emerged in the Senate, filled with pork and all sorts of things that people hate. Fine. But at least the White House signs off on it. But Harry Reid decides, after the White House has signed off on it, that it's the liberals in his party have objected. So we got the pork, and he decides, I'm getting rid of the whole thing, or at least scaling it back to something about $15 billion a year. So then we get partisanship. And then on top of that, it's basically pointless. $15 billion a year in a multi-trillion-dollar economy is nothing. It will create no jobs. So we had partisanship, pork, and pointlessness all in one bill. And so this was a bad week for Washington.
Congressman Schock, where are the Republicans going to be on this?
Well, look, I think unfortunately it's more of the same. I mean, all of this talk about bipartisanship, and yet the rhetoric doesn't match the reality. As David Brooks mentioned, there was some Republicans who worked with the Democrats in the Senate to come up with a jobs bill, only to have their leadership put the kibosh on it. We are for creating long-term economic growth. You do that by incentivizing entrepreneurialism, risk-taking, and investment. You do that through creating certainty in the markets, through certain tax incentives, and that's where we'll be on a jobs bill.
So it sounds like you like what the Democrats are doing here.
Well, I don't like all the pork that was in the bill. $787 billion stimulus bill, the largest spending bill in history. One of the reasons why it didn't create long-term growth is it didn't have stimulative tax cuts in it, but rather a lot of pork and spending.
Which are the least stimulative things in the stimulus. I mean, when you assess what creates jobs in the stimulus plan, it's the tax cuts that were put in order to try to win Republican votes that didn't come anyway, that are the least effective thing in the stimulus bill. So the theory doesn't match the practice here. But, you in your district,
I
just this week, you were at a community college touting a $350,000 green technology education program, talking about how great that was going to be for your district. You voted against the bill that created that grant. And so that's happening a lot, with Republicans sort of taking credit for things that Democratic bills do, and then Republicans simultaneously touting their votes against them and trashing them. That's, I think, a problem that needs to be resolved within your caucus, because, I mean, you seem like a very nice person, but that's a very hypocritical stance to take.
Well, Rachel, with all due respect, I can assure you Republicans were not consulted on a stimulus bill. That bill was filed at 11 p.m. The night before the 10:30 a.m. we began debating it. None of our amendments were considered. There was no debate, no bipartisanship on that bill.
How about the
let me take it, Rachel, which is the question about you. You've called for spending caps out of Washington. But to Rachel's point, does that mean that you will not accept any federal money that comes the way of your district?
No, I think that argument that liberals are making is absolutely ridiculous. With all due respect, Rachel, does that mean you're going to give back your Bush tax cuts that you continue to rail against? The fact of the matter is our country operates and governed by a majority. And I, along with almost all of my Republican colleagues and a good number of Democrats, have voted against the stimulus, the omnibus, all of this runaway spending. but we've lost those battles in the House. And at the end of the day,
but you'll take the money for your district.
At the end of the day, my constituents and their children and grandchildren will be on the hook for the debt that's being created by this majority, and they deserve to have their fair share of federal spending.
Harold, I was in Congress for 10 years. I can tell you, your party ran up a lot of debt. Matter of fact, we grew from the 8 years that President Bush was there. The rate of growth exceeded any other presidents in the history of the nation. So we find ourselves at a moment. Well, no, this president, he's only been in a year. I know you all want to blame him for everything, but you can't blame him for quite everything yet. And I don't want to blame President Bush, but we got to put it in context. Two, I love it when Republicans talk about the desire to come around the table and work together. It was a Republican-Democrat thing that happened in the Senate. It was Grassley and Baucus, and it was Hatch and Schumer. That was the centerpiece of the stimulus bill. The jobs bill was working its way through the Senate. But it was McConnell who told Reid the other day, I will not work to collect any votes for this bill if you bring it to the floor. There has to be a genuineness and a sincerity here. Republicans say they want deficit reduction and deficit control. They vote against a deficit commission. I do hope President Obama will use an executive order to create a deficit commission, in spite of what Republicans may say. You can't have it one day, Monday in the morning, and have a different message in the afternoon on Tuesday. I think it just has to be fair. Now, Democrats deserve some blame here, but Republicans have to be honest, too. This conversation exemplifies
what's wrong with Washington. It's like two guys fighting in the ocean to see who drowns first. I mean, both parties are responsible for the deficits, and both parties are responsible for the fiscal suicide. And if you look at the polls that came out, a whole bunch of polls came out this week, and they show both parties very negative. Unprecedented levels of distrust in Washington. Unprecedented, historically high levels of people who want to get rid of their member of Congress from both parties. A level of distrust of Washington that is absolutely unprecedented in American history. And it's because the two sides are trying to fight each other than actually do something bipartisan or actually do anything. And so bipartisanship has become a wedge issue, a way to make the other party look bad. So bipartisanship has been twisted into just another partisan reign.
But the issue is not bipartisanship qua bipartisanship. It's hypocrisy. I mean, if you are for PAYGO, if you're for a deficit commission, until the president of the other party comes around for it and then you're against it, we're not talking policy anymore. We're not talking about bipartisanship. You shouldn't be blamed for not getting Republican votes on that. That's hypocrisy. If you vote against the omnibus bill, if you complain about the omnibus bill, if you tout your vote against the omnibus bill, it is hypocrisy to then go to your district and go to a ribbon-cutting ceremony for something that's funded by the omnibus bill that you voted against. It's not just bipartisanship as a sort of platonic virtue.
I can pick up the Democratic points if Obama wants to say, I'm going to balance the budget, and then say, but I won't cut taxes on the bottom 98%. Well, that's also somewhat hypocritical or inconsistent. If he says, I want bipartisan health care, but then invites the cameras into a bipartisan discussion and already has the plan he's going to come out with after the health care summit, that's also slightly political.
David's right about one thing, and it's the bigger point from my party. I was astonished by what happened with the jobs bill also. We are in the majority. We have an obligation to govern. And the American people react and revolt when politicians feel like they know what voters want. Health care is important, but if we don't focus on jobs and jobs and jobs again, I think Vice President Biden was right. Democrats will suffer in the fall. The reality is families are having problems at home. Businesses are having problems running themselves, or should say people running them are having problems. And the reality is people are worried about their future. And ultimately, your point is the right one. I only make the point about the back and forth of it. There has to be some honesty about bipartisanship. You can't in the morning say you want it, in the afternoon
well, let's talk about the prospect of bipartisanship when it comes to health care. The president will have a summit on February 25th. The cameras will be on. There'll be Republicans and Democrats there to talk about the issues. The truth is, Congressman, that health care reform is in trouble. But are the Republicans on health care prepared to say yes to anything?
Absolutely. From day one, back in April, I joined with over 100 Republican colleagues of mine on a letter with John Boehner and Eric Cantor to the president, who said, Mr. President, we want to work with you on health care reform. We have ideas. We want to meet with you. And for the good part of that year, the president spent his time only working with Democratic members. And it wasn't until the losses in New Jersey and Virginia and subsequently the Scott Brown election in Massachusetts that it forced them to the table to talk about truly wanting to work with us. Unfortunately, yesterday we learned that Speaker Pelosi and Harry Reid are now trying to develop a new bill before the February 25th summit. If that's the case, I think it's unfortunate. We need to start from scratch, which is where the American people are on this issue. They have overwhelmingly rejected both the House and the Senate versions. And if the president was willing to start from scratch, is truly willing to be a negotiator and meet us halfway where the American people are, we will support it.
Rachel, how difficult is it that the White House clings to the belief that the best way to win the argument on health care is to pass it first? It's a very difficult way to apply leverage on Republicans to cooperate.
Well, I mean, the last time that we had Republicans in to do a bipartisan summit, or the first time we had Republicans in for a bipartisan summit at the White House, right, was March of last year. We spent the entire summer while the Senate Finance Committee didn't meet. Senate Finance Committee with 3 more Democrats on it than Republicans. So instead, this bipartisan group of 6 could meet to try to work it out. The Republicans in the House proposed 4 planks that they wanted in health reform. They wanted buy insurance across state lines, allowing individuals to pool together, state innovation, and tort reform. Versions of all of those things are in the bill. Famously in April, President Obama said, if I'm willing to go a lot further than I have on tort reform, what are you willing to give? Republicans said nothing. We're literally not willing to give anything in exchange for that. So the idea that it's just now that Democrats want to sit down with Republicans is, again, it's factually wrong, even though it's Beltway common wisdom.
David Brooks, will there be reform this year?
I would say the chances are 70% no. I mean, I don't think there's going to be much of a deal. I think the big picture is if you average like the last 10, 15 polls on the Democratic health care reforms, it's against probably 55 no, 38% yes, something like that. It's just hard to do a big national transformation when the public.
But that's something you wrote this week, that voters are in no mood for a wave of domestic transformation.
Right.
Were they initially?
I don't think so. I think, you know, we had a period between 1932 and 64 where people basically trusted their government. And that ended because of Vietnam and Watergate and a lot of other reasons. When the president came in, it was not like 32 and 64. People had this incredibly high level of distrust. And if they had this economic security and you come at them with an institution they distrust with a whole bunch of change, they're going to have even more insecurity. They're going to recoil. I think that's what's happened. I think the president would have been wiser to go step by step to rebuild that trust in government. I still think that's what you should do today.
I want to talk about 2010 politics, and I want to turn to you, former Congressman Ford. The question of whether you're going to run to challenge New York Senator Gillibrand in New York. You're being coy about this, and yet everything you're doing has the hallmark of you being a candidate. Are you going to run?
I haven't decided yet. I'll make a decision in the next few weeks. I have to tell you, the travels around the state have been great, encouraged, humbled by what people are saying. The press and the pundits are focused on carpetbagging and some of the politics around it, but people in New York are expressing the same concerns that we've been expressing around the table. It's a big concern about health care, but a bigger concern about the economy and jobs.
Well, let's talk about some of the carpetbagging issues. One of the questions that's come up is, are you really a New Yorker? Do you pay taxes in New York? Have you filed at least a partial return for the time you spent there?
Absolutely. Paid taxes on all New York income the last 2 years, and for the first time in 2009, my wife and I will file as residents of New York. But this is politics. They've tried to distort my record on choice, distort my record on other social issues. But at the end of the day, voters in New York are as unsettled and as worried about their futures as any other set of voters across the country. At the end of the day, many people in the state don't know Senator Gillibrand, don't know a whole lot about her. But there'll be time if I run to litigate that line by line. The bigger issue, I think, is what David has raised, and partially what the Congressman has raised here. Democrats, we are in a position to make things happen. People are no longer interested in keeping score in Washington. They want outcomes. And at the end of the day, if we are not seen are not able to show how we're producing jobs and at least mindful of reining in the size and the growth of government, because every business, every household is reining it in. I hate to use the example of being in the airport and listening to someone share with me how they're sitting around their table cutting back, and they said, you better, if you get there, make government cut back. And we've got to be mindful of that as Republicans and Democrats.
Bigger picture is important, but so is accountability on some issues, including a couple of others that have come up for you. There's so much talk and anger about bonuses on Wall Street. You have worked for Merrill Lynch. Are you going to release how big your bonus was with Merrill Lynch and other tax return information so voters know?
David, if I become a candidate, I was in Congress for 10 years. I understand the closures. The simple answer is yes, but I'm not a candidate yet. I've answered questions throughout, and again, I understand.
But you won't say how big your bonus was with Merrill?
I had a contract with Merrill Lynch. I had a number of things I had to do. I satisfied that, and I was paid. I make no bones about it. New York City, New York State depend heavily on Wall Street. I'm a believer that the system ought to be reformed, but putting a tax on banks at a time in which the recovery is as timid and as fragile as it is, 680,000 New Yorkers work in this industry, the importance of the revenue to the city and to the state of New York, I'm not afraid, nor am I ashamed to say, if I run for the Senate and I win, I will defend the biggest industry in my state.
So how big was the bonus?
David, if I run for office, I'll talk about all of those things.
What about the question of whether you're pro-choice or pro-life has come up? Final question on this, which is, would you support parental notification in New York, something it now does not have?
I have in the Congress. I voted against late-term abortions. I voted against late-term abortions. I am pro-choice. The record has been distorted. The president of the Tennessee Planned Parenthood has said that Harold is pro-choice. He's a friend. My wife is pro-choice. I can assure you who I wish happy Valentine's Day to this morning. If I were not pro-choice, my wife nor my mother, Mom, happy Valentine's Day too, they neither would allow me in their home.
Parental notification in New York, you'd support it?
I'm for parental notification other than extreme cases where a judge may have to be involved if there's a dispute between a child and a family. If your daughter can't go to an NR-17 movie, David, without some notification, it would seem to me that a family ought to be made aware of some of these.
Rachel Maddow, bigger picture on 2010 politics. What do you think the president can be saying now to Democrats who fear that this is a repeat of 1994 in this regard? The prospect of losing on health care reform, being stymied on health care reform, just as they were stymied on the crime bill as well, that chaos theory that Democrats can't achieve.
Yeah, I think that when Nancy Pelosi noted this week that 200 bills have passed the House that have been sitting in the Senate not going nowhere, and 70% of those, more than 70% of those, had more than 50 Republican votes when they passed the House, is a key of what's going wrong. There's a real problem in the Senate. And the Democrats need to be able to show that they're doing the things the country needs to be done in this difficult economy. And with a broken Senate, they can't do it. And I think that what they're going to need to do, both practically to get stuff done and to show voters that they're serious about it, and that they're not wusses and they can't get rolled the way Republicans love to roll them, is by actually taking on what's broken in the Senate.
And Congressman Schock, what is the reason that Americans should restore Republicans to power in Congress?
Because there needs to be some balance in Washington. You mentioned 94.
Where's the imbalance now? The president hasn't achieved the big things he's trying to get.
Well, I think his agenda is clearly out of touch with mainstream America. It's why we had a rock star president a year ago with over 80% favorabilities, and now he's below 50%. It's because cap and trade, the stimulus, health care bills are out of touch with where America wants us to be. And the Republican Party has been where the American people have been, which is talking about jobs, talking about the economy, talking about tax cuts to get our economy going again. That's what America wants us focused on. And despite the president continuing to talk about jobs, their stimulus packages and bills continue to just spend.
David Brooks, 30 seconds. The outlook.
Well, it's going to be a good year for Republicans. I'm actually beginning to think for the first time in my life there's a prospect for a third party at some point in the future. I just don't see how we get out of the fiscal hole if Republicans are not willing to raise taxes, Democrats not willing to cut spending. I just don't see how we get out of that, and that is the predicate. For the first time in my life, I thought maybe somebody could run a third party for president, not for Congress this year.
Modern-day Ross Perot.
Hopefully a little saner, but yeah.
Okay, we're going to leave it there. The debate will certainly continue. Thank you all very much. I should point out we're going to continue our discussion with Congressman Schock and talk to him about life as the youngest member of Congress. It's in our Meet the Press Take 2 web extra. It's up this afternoon. Plus, look for updates from me throughout the week. It's on our website, mtp.msnbc.com. And we'll be right back.